Let's take a quick and very general look at what a landscape is. Now, the word landscape actually comes from the Dutch, Middle Dutch, landschap, a verb of Germanic origin, which means literally shaped lands. The term was first recorded in 1598 and borrowed from Dutch painters' terms. And you may know, if you studied art history, that in the 16th century, Dutch artists were actually masters of the landscape genre. Landscape in the British sense comes later, means a picture depicting scenery on land, a view, or vista, or some sort of natural scenery. Thus, the idea of landscape contains within it the idea of perspective, that of someone viewing, a view. A single landscape may be experienced from one or more viewpoints, and at each point it may be viewed in one or more directions. Another definition of landscape, this from Peter Goodchild, describes a real or imaginary environment, image or view in which the land is prominent. Landscapes may and often do include humans and man-made components as well, and are the product of the appearances, uses, and perceptions of places. When man-made, we refer to these as cultural landscapes. Cultural landscapes may be urban or rural, archaeological, or industrial, but they are always the result of humans' interaction with the environment and each other. In the words of Carl Sauer, cultural landscape is fashioned from a natural landscape by a cultural group. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium. The cultural landscape is the result. Cultural landscapes, broadly conceived, are not necessarily land-based, but man-made expressions of visual and spatial relationships, narratives of cultures, and expressions of regional identity. According to the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO, there are several different kinds of cultural landscapes. There is a landscape clearly defined, created and designed deliberately by human beings. This can include landscaped areas and parks constructed for aesthetic reasons, sometimes associated with religious buildings or other types of monuments. Also, ecologically evolved landscapes due to social, economic, administrative, or religious needs. These landscapes have evolved over time into their current form as a response to the adaptation to natural surroundings. And according to UNESCO, there are two subtypes: ancient landscapes that are no longer living space, but the original characteristics are still visible, and this would include archaeological sites, and active landscapes, which concern an active landscape which conserves a social role in the contemporary society, associated with traditional lifestyles, and which is continuing to evolve. And this would be pretty much any kind of urban or rural landscape that is currently being lived in an active way by human beings. Then there are associate cultural landscapes, those in which powerful religious, artistic, or cultural associations exist with the natural surroundings. So you can get a sense of cultural landscape as literally what the word means, which is an environment which has been shaped deeply by human beings according to a set of cultural values. They can be agricultural, archaeological. They can be industrial, like the Bethlehem Steelworks in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And they can also be constructed to service particular religious, spiritual, or social needs, like Oakland Cemetery. Cultural landscapes evolve over time, and that can be the expression of economic relationships, communal values, or ethnic identity. If we look at urban landscapes, for instance, we can see that they layer each other over time. We might see different structures from different periods of time within the same landscape. Historical cultural landscapes may devolve from their original context and be adaptively reused. In any case, they are always the expression of larger culture values and relationships. I just wanted to share with you a couple of images from Philadelphia and talk about the way in which particular kinds of landscapes get created in space and time. If we look at Philadelphia, which was the colonial and early Republican city at its heart, we can see that there are several shared styles that are particular to that time. So if we look at the landscape of historic Philadelphia, if you've ever been to Independence Historic National Park and you've walked through that kind of landscape, there are building types of early federal construction, as well as Greek Revival. And this sort becomes part and parcel of the fabric of the landscape of the old walking city of the early 19th and 18th century. We also see landscapes that layer onto this template with expressions of ethnicity, for instance. So in the case of Chinatown in downtown Philadelphia, we can see that Asian motifs and elements that are particular to the culture of these residents have been literally placed onto the historic Federal Row House form. You can see this early Federal Row housing all throughout Center City in Philadelphia. And in the case of Chinatown, the addition of language, signage, and other kinds of cultural motifs, and adaptive reuse, even things like a Buddhist temple, have given an ethnic overlay onto this historic landscape, creating a new cultural landscape. We also see in North Philadelphia, in El Barrio, where Latino migrants and immigrants have adapted again this almost exact same row house form, the classic Philadelphia form of the 19th century, workers' housing for the old industrial neighborhood, and infused it with ethnic aesthetics and uses that are particular to that community. So here, since we have both a historical landscape, historical structures that date to a specific time, that's evolved over time, and now can also be mapped in terms of ethnic and other cultural features, including things like these decorative iron balconies and grating that are added to the front of the 19th century row houses to give them a Caribbean feeling. Finally, cultural landscapes also shape relationships between those who populate and create them. These can include relationships of power, such as those expressed in the Southern slave plantation, our case study for this week.